Hello, everyone, to another episode of Nerd RX podcast, and I'm your host, Barkha. Today is our another special episode where I talk to a PI and ask the PI the question that what is one question they would like to get answered in your lifetime. And for today's episode, we have an old friend of mine from VCU, who is now an assistant professor, Dr. Samuel Obeng. Welcome, Dr. Obeng, to the show.
Hi, Barkan. Nice. Thank you for the invite, and it's nice to be here.
Thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been so long I have seen you. How are you
Yeah,
doing?
I'm doing great. Hope you're doing well too.
I am good. Thank you so much. So, before we jump into the topic, we would love to hear about your experience first, obviously, as an undergrad or PhD student, and what led you to choose opioid as your research topic.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So, I would first want to start from maybe when I transitioned from undergrad to grad school. So, I had my undergraduate training in Ghana,
Okay.
and I had my graduate training for my PhD at Virginia Commonwealth University. So at VCU, I had the opportunity of joining Dr. Yansang's laboratory, where had where his research was focused on opioid use disorder. So with that, and with the current crisis in related to opioid use disorder, opioid overdose, that made me see the need for research to focus in that area to help solve this crisis. And that led me to pursue a postdoc again in opioid use disorder field at University of Florida, where I joined Dr. Christopher McKedy and Dr. Lance McMahon to further study natural products that can be used as treatments for opioid use disorder as well as opioid withdrawal. So these transitions led me to my current research, where I'm focused still on trying to find a treatment for opioid use disorder.
Wow, that's a big one. And throughout your career, you have stayed in opioid research. So it's been a long journey for you.
Yeah. From it's been 9 years now in
Wow.
opioid use disorder research. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's great. So you are an assistant professor where currently?
I'm currently an assistant professor at Samford University in the McWhorter School of Pharmacy in Birmingham,
Okay.
Alabama.
Oh, nice. Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
So, opioid crisis. Would you mind giving us how did this began and why are we in this place right now?
So the opioid crisis, it's been since the 1980s. It
Wow.
was realized that then it wasn't a huge problem, but it was realized that in the 1980s that doctors were not treating that much for pain, like they were overlooking pain. So what? So now the solution was how can we help manage pain? And currently the best treatments for pain are opioids because
Yes,
they can be used in acute pain and also chronic pain conditions.
correct.
Now, this resulted in an increase in the prescription of opioids to treat opioid use to treat pain. In addition to that, pharmaceutical companies also started pushing their products uh,
Right.
to uh, to doctors that yeah, my product is the best, and this can be used to treat pain. And they didn't focus that much on the addictive effects of opioids. So now, with this in mind, with these increased prescriptions, this led a lot of patients to become uh, to, to become addicted to the opioids. Now, with time, what happened in the early 20, let me say about 10 years ago, and when it was realized that people were abusing the prescriptions, those significant decrease in the number of opioids that are being prescribed for pain.
It took
So
them
this
so
led,
long?
yeah, it took them so long. I'm sure if you've listened to the news, it's just been recently that most of the Purdue Pharma and even some of the other pharmaceutical companies as well have been were sent to
Yeah.
court to
Yeah.
have them pay for this, like the crisis that
Yeah.
resulted from their prescription of their sorry medications. Yeah. Yeah, so and maybe just I didn't end in how right now it is now. So let me just so now with when in the prescriptions the doctors stopped prescribing the opioids. Now patients now needed a substitute for that. So people now started using heroin, which they found on the streets, fentanyl, and heroin and fentanyl, because it's much cheaper to make fentanyl than to make heroin. So a lot of these illicit manufacturers of these opioids would add some fentanyl to the heroin. And fentanyl is very potent. As a
Yeah.
result, patient, no, not a patient, like someone who has opioid use disorder would only need a little bit of that heroin to get that high.
Correct.
But on the other hand, fentanyl is very deadly because it can decrease or inhibit your respiration, and that is what causes the deaths from opioid overdose. So that's been so right now in the US, it's a huge problem. For instance, even if you are to look at the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, so just to give you numbers, in 2019, there were about 40,000 deaths in the United States from
Wow.
opioid use disorder alone. That's only used opioid overdose. In 2020, it jumped to 70,000, from 40,000 to 70,000.
Oh my
In
goodness.
2021, there were 80,000 people who died from opioid overdose, and that's a huge number because
Yeah.
if yeah, just putting that in perspective, if you are to see the number of people who died from car accidents in the United States in 2021, that's about 40,000. Number of people who died from even firearms too was about 47,000. So you can see that just opioid overdose alone is claiming a lot of lives in the United States.
Wow. And
Yeah.
do you think this issue, like I know in the US it's a huge issue, do you think it is as serious all over the world or it's particularly in the US?
It's it's if you're looking at it or say globally, I would say the United States and Canada have a huge opioid use disorder problem. In Europe too, they have this problem, but it's not as bad as it is in the United States. So that's the I think that the differences. And sometimes too in Europe, the substance of abuse there is quite different from that in the United States. Even in the United States, just to even give you an idea, opioid use disorder is not like generally all across. For instance, in the east part of the United States, that's where there's a lot of opioid use disorder.
Okay.
And in the western part, a lot of addicts usually tend to take cocaine. So
Oh,
it's
it's
quite
regional
different.
specific.
Yeah, it's regional specific. Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
It's like, you think about opioid crisis, but when you actually hear the numbers, it's
yeah,
unbelievable. Like you mentioned,
yeah.
it's 80,000 in 1 year.
In one
That's,
year,
and after so many years of recognizing the problem, it's still, the numbers are so high.
yeah. And currently, drug overdose in general is the leading cause of death for
Correct.
Americans under 50. Yeah, so that's the leading cause of death currently. And because of this, there has been a decrease in the life expectancy of Americans
Right.
because of drug overdose. And mostly that is contributed by opioid overdose.
Wow. So let me ask you, what are your thoughts on how should we as a society, and obviously all the scientists and the government, it's a team effort, How do you think we can address this issue and hopefully solve it one day?
I would say we should see opioid use disorder as any other chronic condition. In that way, we would, for instance, just as you would see someone having suffering from hypertension, if you see that patient too in that same light and not see it as if as it's the patient's fault for that condition, if we change our perspective or thinking in how to treat this disease, it's going to lead into one, patients are going to feel confident and in approaching healthcare officials or healthcare workers to help them solve their addiction. Because in opioid, even in generally drugs, substances of abuse, these compounds increase dopamine levels
Correct.
in the reward centers in the brain. As a result, taking that medication is now even more important to them than taking food and other natural things that give us pleasure. So, if we are able to see that this is a serious problem, which we have to see the patients as any other patient suffering from a chronic condition, and then
Correct.
combine pharmaceutical or pharmacological treatments with behavioral treatments. For instance, because most of the time the behavioral cues are the ones which would lead to patients relapsing into opioid use disorder or any other substance abuse disorder. So if we have a combined pharmaceutical treatments with uh, with behavioral or psychosocial treatments, that would be an awesome way of treating it. But in the but the ultimate goal is to find a treatment for opioid use disorder that would decrease relapse. Because currently, to treat opioid use disorder, patients are prescribed methadone and buprenorphine. Now, these compounds although they have less rewarding effects compared to heroin and morphine and other opioids, but they still have rewarding effects.
Correct.
So if we are able to make a compound that uh, patients can take and would feel like they are taking an opioids, but that compound does not produce a rewarding effect, that would be
Right.
an ideal treatment. And but just to further explain this again, we have a drug discrimination study. I say the drug discrimination study is used to identify whether a compound feels like another compound.
Yes.
Yeah, so if a patient can be given an like a new compound, right? We can make a new compound. The patient will take it and would feel that it's maybe like an opioid. However, that same compound does not cause self administration
Correct.
or
Okay.
rewarding. That would be an awesome way of solving this crisis, and it would reduce the number of current relapses that occur due to opioid due to the current treatments that we have.
You kind of got like you got a very good point about when I asked you this question, that changing our perspective and how we see people.
Hmm.
And that is actually so important because I'm pretty sure most of the people who are addicted to opioids don't want to, they can't control the reflexes. And they are quite often, labeled as, like, I hate to say this word, but junkies. And it's kind of you're like degrading them by just, you're not helping them in any way.
Yeah.
So, changing the perspective and treating it as, like you said, a disease.
Hmm.
And that is, I think, the first step we should take. I was just at a conference about like endocannabinoids, which I work another class of drugs of abuse, by the way. So, and there someone mentioned that now, because this crisis is so out of control, like people should walk around with Narcan.
Yeah.
And You know, that just the thought of that is crazy.
Yeah, because with Narcan is like a lifesaver.
Yeah.
Because if someone is overdosing on opioid without Narcan, the person would die in a few minutes. But if you administer Narcan immediately, the patient or let me say the patient would recover and would can be sent to the hospital for treatment.
Yeah,
So,
it
and
is.
I agree too as well. Having Narcan on hand is going to help save a lot of
it
lives.
it has become like an EpiPen. Like people with
Yes,
uh,
yes.
anaphylactic shocks, like they carry EpiPen, and it's like, imagine we are in a state where it's our, like as a society, it's our responsibility now to carry Narcan to
Mhm.
help someone in crisis.
Yeah,
That is crazy to me.
yeah. And one thing too I'd want to mention about the opioid crisis is that, especially the patients suffering from opioid use disorder, is that most of these patients were people who were prescribed prescription opioids.
Right.
And maybe like you, let's say sometimes maybe we think when we think someone suffering from opioid use disorder, we tend to think it's like someone who is, uh, as you let me say, as the word you use, like a junkie. But if you look, you'd carefully realize that this woman may be someone who was like working, doing a good
Yeah.
job, a teacher or a doctor or a nurse, like someone who was productive in society, but
Yeah.
maybe had an injury or had a pain condition where he or she was prescribed opioids. Then with time, the person got addicted onto those opioids. And when the prescriptions were no more being prescribed to the patient had to get something else to substitute. And the person now got started using heroin, started using fentanyl and others. And that is what has resulted in a number of people suffering from this disorder. Just that transition from prescriptions to street drugs is been a big problem.
Right. And let me ask you this: how uh, easily does it take to get addicted to opioid? Because I remember, like, I had just few years ago, in my PhD, I had my wisdom tooth removed. I was prescribed opioids. I was so surprised, but just for this wisdom tooth extraction, I and I was like handed the prescription with oxycodone. I think that's the most
Yeah.
commonly used. How easily can a person get hooked to it?
So that one, I would say it's variable. Some people would take opioids and they're like, I'm not going to take this anymore.
Yeah, that
Because
was me.
yeah, because sometimes this drug can make you feel you would want to throw up and all that. So most people would not want to take it, but others, to some, would take it and uh, with time, maybe let's say within a week or a month of taking this drug, then they will become hooked to it because
Wow,
opioids uh, inhibit. Uh, we have GABA neurons
correct.
that are involved in releasing dopamine in the reward center, and opioids inhibit those neurons. As a result, there's an increase in dopamine. So it would take time for that dopamine to go levels to go up. Now, once those dopamine levels go up with taking an opioid, then it's going to be a big problem in trying to reverse it because substance of abuse like opioids and even cocaine, these increase dopamine levels so much that natural things that would increase dopamine no more produce
Well,
any
yeah.
effect for you.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's kind of altering your brain.
Yeah, yeah. So, and as I mentioned, if we see people suffering from opioid use disorder as a patient, that the substance has altered the function of their brain,
Direct.
that way is we are going to see them. I think even in that way we are going to see them as a human. Let me
Yeah.
use that
Yeah.
word, and then would have that we will have treatment for them,
Yeah.
and I think that way would be an awesome way of treating this disorder.
Right. So I know there are like so many other classes of drugs that now people are trying to substitute with opioid like compounds. For example, endocannabinoids are a big one
Hmm.
because they are also very good in treating pain and endocannabinoids have been like are being currently pushed a lot to replace opioids. So, is there any favorite class you think would be, oh, this looks good, this is promising that this could replace opioids one day, according to you?
That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. Opioids are one of the medications that have been used for over 1,000 years.
Right.
Since I think that even that was in the, if I can remember the dates, that is even like the 1 BC or so. I've forgotten the exact date when the Sumerians started growing opioids and they realized this is can be used to treat a lot of things. So opioids have been used to treat pain, diarrhea, and other conditions for a very long time. And we've not been able to get an ideal replacement for opioids to treat pain. I'm talking about specifically pain because that's what opioids are mostly used to.
Yeah.
So if we can do that, I think that would be a good. So currently, to treat for opioids, my perspective would is this: to use an opioid that has less abuse liability.
Okay.
I know the other ways of treating pain, for instance, alpha 2 adrenergic agonists. Those are also good ways of treating pain. And as you mentioned, cannabinoids are also good ways of treating pain. But at the same time, too, for acute pain, most of the time you would need an opioid.
Correct.
And we've not had a very good substitute for opioids, unless maybe you would want to completely block neurons by using sodium channel blockers like anesthetics. That way, but you cannot be on an anesthetic for a
Yeah.
very long time. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the major challenge in this field.
Wow. This is crazy. Like, I was just drifting away for a bit. I was actually doing like my first special episode. I was doing that with Dr. Arijit Sarkar. You know him,
Okay.
like from
Yes.
VCU. So he was talking about drug resistance issue
Mhm.
we have going on, and he mentioned something very interesting, and I immediately thought of you. And he said that opioid crisis is also in a way responsible for this drug resistance issue because of sharing needles.
Yeah. In addition, yeah, so there's a lot of sharing needles, a
Yeah.
lot. So one thing too that uh, even because of that is now in among opioid users, they have a lot of HIV, a lot of
Correct.
especially diseases that can be transmitted through needle sharing. There's a lot of that problem, and that's true. And we hope this can be managed. And yeah, I was going to say something which I've remembered. I think one way of also as you mentioned, the needle sharing is a big problem. So right now, one thing that is being done is by providing patients with opioid use disorder needles, so that the person would not have to share a needle with another person. If I think because that one thing which we should realize that no matter what, the opioid has altered the patient's
Yeah. Mental
brain's
state.
function.
Yeah.
So if the person is even given maybe like a needle to help prevent the patient from getting another disease. Then, with time, you'd now transition that patient from using that street opioid heroin that they were injecting to maybe buprenorphine, which is the current treatment for opioid use disorder. Then, with time, as a patient now switches to buprenorphine, then they can later maybe completely be weaned off the opioid. So I think it's a humane way
Correct.
of treating of seeing this problem.
I think there is nothing like opioid crisis where just the thought of it, like you providing them needles. It
Yeah.
sounds crazy, but as you mentioned, it's the most humane way to,
Yes.
I don't think it's something like cigarette smoking that you
Yeah.
could try and do cold turkey and just
Yeah.
quit one day, you know?
No.
It will require a
Yeah.
long rehabilitation for these
Yeah.
patients.
And even now, there are clinics around where if someone has opioid use disorder, the person can go to that clinic and the person would be allowed to inject, like given a needle to inject the opioid. And there are people there to see that patient just to make sure that the
Correct.
person does not overdose, right?
Wow.
Then the person will go their way, right? So it's, as I mentioned, it's a humane way of seeing it. With that, the person would see that you are caring for that for him or
Correct.
her, and then that can lead to the patient overcoming the addiction through treatment, through both pharmacological treatment and behavioral treatment.
Correct. Wow. So I think my one question, like I've asked so many questions, but I think the most important
Yeah,
question for this episode, what is that one question you would like to get answered in your career or your lifetime?
that's a very interesting question. And for me, I would want to find out, can I separate out the discriminative effects of an opioid from the rewarding effects of an opioid?
Wow.
If you can separate that out, then that means we can get a good treatment for opioid use disorder.
Wow. So it's all up to the medicinal chemists of the world.
And behavioral pharmacologists.
Yeah. Absolutely. Wow.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah.
Well, and do you have any article you can suggest our listeners about opioid or opioid crisis in general so that I can put that in my show notes so people can go and read about it?
Like one paper I would recommend, I would say not necessarily about the crisis per se, but just the research that is being done in finding a treatment for opioid use disorder. Is a paper by I think Schmidt. That's the title of the paper is Bias Factor and Therapeutic Window Correlates to Predict Safer Opioid Analgesics. It's a paper that I think it's a 2017 paper published in Cell.
Okay. Okay.
So again, I can give the title again: Bias Factor and Therapeutic Window Correlate to Predict Safer Opioid Analgesics.
Perfect. I will make sure to have it linked down in the description. And I think with that, thank you so much, Dr. Obeng. It was so good to see you again, but the topic was a little sad, but we're hopeful because people like you are working towards cure.
Thank you, Tivaka, for the invite, and we hope we'll be able to get an ideal treatment for opioid use disorder so that this crisis will be solved to help save lives in the United States and around the world.
Yep. Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Obeng. And listeners, I will catch you next week on another episode of Nerd RX podcast. And in meanwhile, if you have any suggestions about topic or if you would like to join me for an episode, please email me at barkha@nerdrxpodcast.com. And remember, it's good to be a nerd. Bye.